For the background of Asch's study, Forming Impressions of Personality, which began in 1943 and finished in 1946, likely because there are 10 experiments conducted and it takes a long time to do so. So this study came about when the experimenters were thinking about the idea of impressions themselves and how impressions are created from a simple glance or a few spoken words, but impressions are a complex thing about a complex human being who is full of life, and more than likely is so much more than that quick impression that they get. So they ask themselves, how do several characteristics function together to produce an impression of one person, and what principles regulate this process? So that was the basis for their experiments and what they're trying to get out of the experiment. They're trying to understand what characteristics and what are the rules that kind of regulate making an impression. This study would fall under the cognitive level of analysis, which is defined by mental processes like perception, attention, etc. And this experiment works with perceptions because an impression is a perception of a person.
Design. In this experiment done by Asch, the design that they used consists of independent measures, meaning that they use different participants for each trial. It states on page 262, there were 90 subjects in Group A comprising 4 separate classroom groups, 76 in Subject B comprising 4 separate classroom groups. This means that which in the main group, which would be Group A and Group B, there were smaller groups within these, and each one of these 4 groups, or 8 altogether, had one separate trial. These trials were when they read the list and wrote a description about the person using the words from the checklist, and it also includes them ranking the words based upon which ones were the most necessary for the experiment. Some strengths of using independent measures for the design include how their procedure was simple enough to explain to multiple people, meaning that even though they had many groups, each time they had to explain or brief the participants, the briefing was simple. It states on page 258, we have apparently no need to commit to memory by repeated drill the various characteristics we observe in a person. They use this to their advantage with making this study. By taking this into consideration, it means they don't have to memorize the checklist that they created, which is listed on page 259. Instead, the people can look and pick from this checklist. Although a limitation of allowing the people to use this checklist was that the people would use multiple examples from the checklist. Another strength of the design is how they use the independent measures. They have 2 groups, which consist of Group A and Group B, and these 2 groups were split by how they would want the participants to interpret the meaning of the words. So Group A had warm words, which consist of positive meanings and compliments, one could say. while group B had cold words which contain negative connotations. Using independent measures for these groups benefit the experiment because the participants will not be reused or they will not be switched over to another group, meaning participants who were originally in the warm group will not move to the cold group. If they were moved from warm to cold, there is a possibility that the participants would mix up the meanings or interpret it differently than what the experimenter wanted. There were only slight differences between warm and cold. Everything else was pretty much the same. So having to re-explain to the participants that everything seems the same but is actually different would confuse some participants and possibly make it more difficult when interpreting the data. Design continued. The aim of this study is to research how two opposite words impact impressions and how they are formed. The independent variable is the words used in the character quality list, warm or cold. The dependent variable was the description given by the participants or individual. Research hypothesis. It is hypothesized that the change in words will create a shift in the description given. As all qualities do not have the same weight, the use of word cold will result in a more negative description of the individual, while the word warm will result in a more positive description. Null hypothesis. There is no correlation or relationship between the change in words or words used and the description given of the individual.
The procedure of this study basically is two separate groups which heard a list of character qualities identical except for one term. So the two groups were group A and B, and the word that they heard different was warm or cold. So group A heard and read intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious. And in contrast to that, group B heard intelligent, skillful, industrious, cold, determined, practical, and cautious. So the two differences is warm and cold, and that was to see if these two different words will create different impressions of a person, whether it'll be good or bad. But they just want to see how those two words change the certain perceptions or the certain impression. And then directly after this, they would write a sketch or aka a description of the person they read. So it was just what they think the person is like. Then after that, they had to read a checklist which presented pairs of traits that were mostly opposites, very extreme opposites, and then the subjects would choose which most relates to the impression that they formed.
The results of a study showed that the warm and the cold conditions produced very noticeable and prominent differences in the impressions that were formed by the participants of the individual. And the group A, which had the word warm, gave a lot more positive impression compared to group B, which had the word cold. So in series A, which was the warm condition, an example of a sketch given by a participant of the individual was a person who believes certain things to be right, wants others to see his point, would be sincere in an argument, and would like to see his point won, compared to an example of a participant in series B giving a sketch, which was a cold condition, which was a rather snobbish person who feels that his success does intelligence set him apart from a run-of-the-mill individual, calculating and unsympathetic. Here there is a clear difference, as in Series A, all of the words used to describe the individual have a lot more of a positive connotation compared to in Series B, where most of the words have a negative connotation. So the data that was collected showed the frequency in terms of percentages with which each term in the checklist was selected, and the data that was collected was parametric because when distributed it would fall on a bell curve as seen in table 3, and it was also interval data because, again, as seen in table 3, it was ranked, and it standardized the characteristics of the behavior of participants. The distribution of the results from a checklist was studied to categorize the participants and demonstrate the difference between the different groups. And then through inferential statistics and the categorizing that was demonstrated in the interval data, a significant difference was shown between the data grouping. So this difference was clear, and it was demonstrated how the results differed based on each group through the use of statistics and the specific data that was collected. And the results also only show group trends, and the group results are a statistical artifact as the checklist choices revealed individual differences, but when they were distributed based on the choice from a checklist, the groups were almost identical to the warm and cold conditions that of all the other experiments that were performed. Overall, the results of the study and this experiment demonstrated that the change in lung quality produced a widespread change in the impression. This was shown because when the words in the description, such as warm or cold, were changed, then the overall impression that the participant had developed about the person was also changed. Characteristics do not all have the same weight, as they can either be central or peripheral. So in this example, warm and cold were peripheral characteristics, which is why they had as much of an impact on the general impression. And another result was that the checklist showed prevalent reversals between the groups and fitting characteristics, so some qualities are more warm or cold, or the participants perceive them to be that way. So the data that was collected in the experiment was both qualitative and quantitative, as numerical data was collected, but also the language that was used in the sketches and the words used to describe the individual by the participants were also used as data. So conclusions drawn from this experiment are that the characteristics given to the participants do not all have the same weight for each individual participant. A participant could assign one characteristic to higher than others based off of how important they perceived it to be. And another conclusion is that the weight of the characteristics would vary from subject to subject. So the conclusions that may be drawn from this experiment may be accurate, but this one experiment did not fully explain impressions, which is why other experiments were later conducted in the study by Asch to fully understand impressions. So they only offer a partial view of what is necessary to form an impression.
Ethics. On 258, it states, "We also know that this process, though often imperfect, is also at times extraordinarily sensitive." They are talking about the procedure they will use in this experiment. They want the people to determine a person's personality based off of a reading. It may be considered insensitive for people to judge one based off of one meeting or one description. However, for the point of this experiment, it is required. On page 260 it states, "Though they expressed genuine interest in the task, the subjects were not aware of the nature of the problem until it was explained to them." That means that the subjects did not clearly understand the experiment until they were briefed, which have some ethical issues that come along with it. However, they make sure to brief the participants before they conducted the experiment.
In the experiment, both sexes participated, so the subjects were both male and female, although a majority of the subjects were women. All of the participants were also college students that were beginners in psychology and showed some interest in the subject. There could be a limitation based on the culture of the participants, which isn't mentioned in the study, because culture could limit the applicability of results, as different cultures could have different perceptions and interpretations of specific traits. And these different traits in different cultures could also have more of a negative or a positive connotation, so this would result in different impressions and be a confounding variable. And the experiment also took place in a lab setting, and the context in which these impressions were formed was unrealistic, so that is also a limitation of the applicability of the study.
The importance of this study is that it explains a lot about human nature. It discusses the formation of impressions that occur in humans when interacting with a new individual. The experiment also opened the door to many more experiments Asch conducted to better understand impression. So this was the stepping stone into impressions. It got the ball rolling. It led to the better understanding of what or understanding of the intricacies of impressions and how they work and what goes on in forming them.